Hi everyone, it's Hewett, an Executive Managing Partner at ChiuGroup, and we're back here today with another video on 5 common nonprofit terms. So these are terms that have a very specific meaning in the nonprofit industry, but have a sort of a different meaning in our regular lives. And so we've learned as we went along the way, the first time we were nonprofit entrepreneurs, what these terms meant. So it would be very, very helpful as you start developing your nonprofit to know exactly what different people and different supporters and funders and donors are saying when they use these terms. So let's take a look at what these terms are. The first term is development. So in the nonprofit world, this is a big thing, and it's also a very specific thing. In our regular lives, when we say development, we're talking about, sort of like creating something or coming up with something, like I'm developing, a game plan or something like that. In the nonprofit world, it sort of has the same meaning, but it actually means fundraising. So development specifically refers to not-for-profit fundraising. Whenever you hear of a development officer or a development function or development department, what they're doing is they're actually fundraising. So it's basically used synonymously. So foundations are huge development vehicles for helping to drive grants and funds to not-for-profits who are undergoing development efforts, right? So that's an example of how you would use development in the nonprofit world. The next term is program officer. So when you normally think about an officer, you could think about a police officer, or you could think about in the corporate sense, like an officer, like the president and CEO, for example, of a company. A program officer in the nonprofit world is actually a very specific role that's found in foundations. So these are organizations that engage in grant making that give out grants to other nonprofits. So a program officer in a foundation is the individual who's responsible for overseeing a specific program function or a specific program area. So like, for example, if a large foundation does grants in drug and substance abuse and poverty alleviation and environmental health, each of those areas will have a program officer that's directing the efforts of those areas. So the program officer is generally the person you would want to find and talk to when you're looking for a foundation grant. The next term is director. So this is actually in real life a very general term. You hear like, a director of marketing or, a director as in like a film director and a film producer. In the nonprofit world, however, as is also the case in the general corporate world, a director specifically normally means the board of directors, so a board member. These are governing individuals who oversee the leadership staff of a nonprofit. So these are individuals who are not compensated. They are not legally allowed to be compensated. They have a duty to loyalty, a duty to care for the organization, and a fiduciary legal duty to oversee the organization. And they are responsible for developing the strategy and the overall governance of the organization. So that's what normally a director means in the nonprofit world. Many nonprofits also use directors as operating terms. So for example, like an operations director or an outreach director. That's okay too, but that's a different type of a director on a different level. That's more of an everyday operational staff level versus the governance board of directors level that we're talking about. The next term is net assets. So net assets is a financial term that's normally not used in the for-profit sector. Net assets is basically equivalent to equity in the for-profit sector. So net assets is assets minus liabilities. The reason why it's not called equity, as it is normally in the for-profit sector, is because there is no equity in nonprofits. There are no shareholders, so that's why no one really holds any equity. In fact, the quote-unquote owners of a nonprofit is actually really the public. the public, the people who the nonprofit serves, are considered the members of the organization, and certain individuals, certain organizations can elect specific individuals as members of the organization as well. But in any case, no one single person really owns any share of a not-for-profit corporation, and so that's why instead of calling it shareholders' equity, we call it the net assets of an organization. So this is particularly important when the nonprofit could be audited, or when you're applying for certain grants and funding. When they ask what are the particular net assets of the organization, you just take the assets minus the liabilities of that organization. An interesting note is in the government, it's also a different term actually. So governments use the term fund balance instead of net assets or instead of equity. Basically means the same thing. It's still the assets minus the liabilities of the government agency. The final term we're going to talk about is RFP. So many of you may know what this means, but in case you don't, you'll hear this all the time in nonprofits, particularly when you're engaging in development. So RFP actually stands for a request for proposal. So this is basically sort of like the first step in the funding cycle of a nonprofit. Normally, when nonprofits are considering grants as a funding option, what they would have to do is they would have to look for RFPs or requests for proposals from different funders, like foundations or like government agencies or any other funders who give out bulk funding. The RFPs have specific guidelines and criteria for you to follow when you're submitting a full application for seeking that funding, and then it becomes more of a competitive process into whether you're eligible to meet the criteria for the funding, and how can you display a cost efficiency and program effectiveness in order to get the funding. But all of these different items are normally laid out in the RFP. So when you go and find an RFP, you would read through it thoroughly to evaluate whether you and your organization will have a good chance at getting that funding. So those are the 5 terms, and just like every video that we do, we like to end with a be careful slide of sort of tips, tricks, and cautions that we personally learned from our own experiences along the way in the nonprofit world. So the first item to be careful of is the context in which you're using these terms. Like we saw before, foundations have a specific role and they have specific terms and practices that they do versus public charities. Like for example, if you're using the term program officer in a foundation, right? An officer means something else in a corporation or in a charity. Likewise, when you're saying director in a charity, in a public charity, you're normally talking about the board of directors versus like a program director in a foundation. The next thing to be careful of is understanding whether you're using the term to talk about the governing board or the leadership staff of an organization. So just like we talked about the term director, right? Are you talking about the board member who sits on the board of directors of an organization, or are you talking about a outreach director or an operations director, or even the ED, the executive director of a nonprofit? The third thing to be careful of is taking a look at whether you're using these terms in the context of fundraising or in the context of financial management. So like for example, when we use the term net assets to report the finances of an organization, right? Within fundraising, in an RFP, they may not necessarily strictly ask you to report the net assets. They may phrase it a little differently, but maybe they're actually asking for the net assets, or maybe they're asking for an income statement or a balance sheet, or they may call it a statement of activities or a statement of financial position, right? So these are all of these different types of terms that we can go on and on forever. They're sort of outside of the scope of this particular video. But the point is to see how are you actually using these terms. Are you using it for the purpose of fundraising or for the purpose of managing the internal finances of your not-for-profit organization? So if you have any questions at all, or if you'd like to further discuss any of these concepts with me, I'd love to hear from you. This is my contact information right here. Please feel free to contact me. If this is your first time watching one of our videos, please subscribe to our channel. We always have new videos coming up on how to effectively and strategically manage, run, and grow your not-for-profit organization. Please like and comment on this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback and to help you think through some challenges that you might be facing. And thank you very much for watching and making it through this video. I'll see you again next time.